wind carried the scent of sagebrush and loneliness that evening, when Clara stepped off the porch of the old boarding house. The sun had dipped low behind the mesas, painting the western sky with dying streaks of orange and blood red, the color of secrets she'd buried too deep. She was 24, young enough that the men in town still looked when she passed, but old enough that they whispered now, whispers born of curiosity and something crueler. No one in Red Bluff really knew where Clara came from. She had arrived one spring with nothing but a weathered suitcase, a pale blue dress, and eyes that didn't belong to anyone who'd known peace. She ran the general store by day, her hands moving steady and polite, her smile always careful. But at night, when the lamplight hit her face just right, something soft and haunted slipped through. A glimmer of a woman who was waiting for something that would never come. That night she wrote a letter she never meant to send. She sat by her window looking over the silent town, the prairie stretching out like an ocean of dark. The paper trembled in her hands as she wrote the words, "I can't bear the nights anymore." Her pen paused. She thought of the child she had lost 2 winters ago, the secret no one in Red Bluff would ever know. She had buried her baby in another town under another name, and fled before the church bells rang for the funeral. Her heart had stopped with the tiny heartbeat she could no longer hear. Since then, every night felt like a slow dying, her room too cold, her body too empty, her soul too heavy. So when the stranger came riding into town that same night, something inside her stirred like the ghost of a flame. He was tall, his hat low, his coat travel-worn and dusted from the trail. His horse was black as sin and twice as tired. He tied it to the post outside the saloon, glanced once at the moon, and walked inside. The piano stopped when he entered. That's how it is in small towns when a man with death in his eyes walks in. Clara saw him from her window. She couldn't explain why she watched him for so long. Maybe it was the way he carried himself, quiet and sure, like a man who had nothing left to prove and nothing left to lose. Hours later, she found herself standing in the doorway of that same saloon, her shawl tight around her shoulders. Men turned to stare and a hush fell over the room. Women didn't come to saloons in Red Bluff, not decent ones anyway. But Clara didn't care about decency anymore. She looked for the stranger, found him sitting alone at the corner table, his whiskey untouched. Their eyes met, 2 broken souls recognizing something familiar. She crossed the room, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it. When she reached his table, she didn't bother with pleasantries. "I need to ask you for something," she said, her voice low, trembling. He looked up, his eyes a stormy gray. "Name it. Sleep with me," she whispered. Just tonight, the room froze. The men at the bar turned. The piano player's hands fell silent and the air grew heavy with disbelief. Clara's face burned, but she didn't look away. The stranger studied her long and quiet, then finally said, "You sure you know what you're asking?" She nodded once, her chin lifting like a challenge, though her eyes glistened with something close to tears. Outside, the desert wind rose, brushing against the windows like a warning. Inside, the whole town held its breath. The silence after her words stretched long enough for her courage to almost break. Every eye in the saloon was on her, waiting to see if the stranger would laugh or walk away. But he didn't. He finished his drink slowly, placed the glass back down, and rose to his feet. "All right," he said simply, his voice low, rough, and calm like the echo of thunder over far hills. A ripple of shock passed through the crowd. Clara's hands trembled at her sides as he stepped closer, tipping his hat to her with the faintest nod as if to say, "If this is what you need, then so be it." Without another word, they left together, the woman with too many ghosts and the man who looked like he'd buried his own. Outside, the desert night was cold and sharp. The moon cast a silver glow across the empty street, lighting the dust in pale swirls around their boots. Clara led the way up the hill toward the boarding house, her footsteps steady though her heart was in chaos. She didn't look back at the saloon, though she could feel the town's eyes burning holes into her back. The stranger followed a few paces behind, saying nothing. His silence wasn't heavy. It was the silence of a man who'd spent too many years with no one to talk to. When they reached her door, she hesitated, her hand on the latch, her breath visible in the chill. "You don't owe me anything," he said quietly behind her. She turned, meeting his eyes. "I know, that's why I asked you." Something flickered across his face, surprise, maybe pity, maybe something deeper. Then he nodded once, removing his hat as she opened the door and stepped inside. The room was small, plain but warm from the fire she'd left burning. He looked around in a bed neatly made, a Bible unopened on the nightstand, a single photograph turned face down. She offered him water, but he refused. They stood there, two strangers held together by something neither could name. She felt her throat tighten as she tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could she tell him that she hadn't touched another soul since the baby died? That every night she woke to phantom cries that faded before her tears did? That she had prayed for peace, but peace had never come? Only silence and the kind of ache that hollowed her from the inside out. He stepped closer, the firelight catching the lines of his face and the scar near his jaw, the weariness in his eyes, the quiet mercy of a man who'd seen too much. "You don't have to talk," he murmured, and that small kindness undid her. A single tear escaped before she could stop it. He brushed it away with the back of his hand, gentle, careful, as though touching her might break something sacred. "I lost someone," she said finally, her voice cracking. I can't stand the emptiness anymore." He swallowed, his throat working. "So did I," he answered, so soft she almost didn't hear. She looked up at him, startled. But before she could ask, he leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't hunger or heat. It was grief meeting grief, two shattered hearts finding warmth in the ruins. His lips were rough, hesitant, but when she didn't pull away, his hands found her face, then her hair. For a long time they just held on. Not to each other's bodies, but to the pieces of themselves they'd lost somewhere along the years. Hours passed like a dream. Outside, coyotes howled from the hills, the sound rising and fading like prayers that never reached heaven. Inside, the fire burned low and the world shrank to the small space between them. He told her his name, Eli Carter, and she whispered hers. He said he'd once been a rancher, before the war took his land and the fever took his wife. "Sometimes," he said, his voice distant, "I ride just to remember what it felt like to be needed." Her breath caught. "And tonight?" He looked at her then, really looked, and said, "Tonight I was needed." She closed her eyes. For a moment she wasn't the broken woman in Red Bluff. She was just Clara again, young and alive, her heart beating in rhythm with his. They didn't speak much after that. The night held its breath as they lay together, not in sin or shame, but in something deeper, something like mercy. And when dawn began to creep through the thin curtains, she watched him sleep for a while. His face was peaceful, and for the first time in years hers was too. She knew it couldn't last. That morning would bring judgment, whispers, maybe worse. But for one night she had remembered what it felt like to be human again. By sunrise, the whole town of Red Bluff was whispering. News in a place like that didn't travel. It spread, carried on the wind, embroidered with shame and fascination until every mouth had a version of it. Clara took a drifter to her bed, they said at the Mercantile. "Did you see them walk through town together?" Someone murmured at the bakery. "She's gone mad with loneliness," claimed the preacher's wife, clutching her pearls as if sin itself were catching. But the strangest thing was that Clara didn't care. For the first time in years she felt light enough to breathe. She worked as she always did, sweeping the porch of her store, feeding the stray dog that lingered by the barrels. But inside her chest, something had shifted. Eli didn't ride away that morning. He stayed, said his horse needed rest, but the truth sat quietly behind his gray eyes. He wasn't ready to leave her. He took up work at the livery, helping the old stable hand mend tack and brush the colts. Folks watched him with suspicion. He was polite, soft-spoken, too gentle for a man who carried so much sorrow. At night, Clara would light the lamp in her window and he would walk up the hill. Sometimes they spoke for hours, sharing bits of their lives like offerings. Her lost child, his lost wife. The dreams both had buried under years of dust and silence. Other nights they didn't talk at all. They just sat together by the window watching the moon climb over the mesas. But the town wasn't built for mercy. By the third week, Pastor Gideon himself came knocking. His shadow fell across her door as he said, "Clara, the Lord forgives, but he does not forget." She met his gaze with steady eyes. "Then maybe he understands," she said softly and closed the door. That night she cried harder than she had since the funeral, not because of guilt, but because she knew how fragile happiness was out here. It came and went like rain in summer, always promised, rarely kept. Eli noticed her quietness the next day. He found her by the creek behind the store sitting on a rock, her dress caught in the wind. He didn't speak at first. He just sat beside her, throwing pebbles into the water. Finally, he said, "You ever wonder if maybe we ain't cursed? Just lonely?" She turned to him, tears drying on her cheeks. "Loneliness is a curse," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, staring at the horizon. "Maybe, but if it weren't for it, I'd have never found you." Those words sank into her like sunlight after a storm. For days after, she carried them inside her like a secret prayer. The nights grew colder, and he started staying at her house more often. Sometimes just to keep the fire burning, sometimes because neither of them could sleep without the other's breathing near. Red Bluff talked, of course. They said she'd thrown away her decency, that the drifter had bewitched her. But behind the gossip there was envy, because every woman who'd ever lain awake beside an empty bed knew that what Clara had found, even for a moment, was something rare. Still, there was a darkness in Eli he couldn't hide forever. One night when thunder rolled in from the east and the sky flashed with wild light, she woke to find him standing at the window, shirtless, his back marked with scars like a map of every sin and battle he'd ever known. She rose quietly, wrapping the blanket around her shoulders. "Eli," she whispered, "what happened to you?" He didn't turn. "The war," he said simply, "but not the kind they write about. The kind where men stop being men and start becoming ghosts." He finally looked at her then, and the pain in his eyes was the same kind she carried in hers. Old, unhealed, but honest. "I ain't proud of what I've done, Clara. You think you saw me that night in the saloon, but I was already gone long before that. You didn't save me. You just reminded me I was still breathing." She reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Then let's keep breathing together," she said. He stared at her as if afraid to believe it, then pulled her into his arms. The storm raged outside, thunder cracking over the valley, but inside, their hearts beat the same rhythm, slow, defiant, alive. For weeks after, it felt almost like they were building something, fragile but real. Eli fixed the broken fence behind her store, taught her to ride again. Sometimes they'd ride together through the red canyons, the wind in her hair, the sun on his face, and for a few stolen hours, they were free. She began to imagine a future again. Maybe a little ranch, a patch of land, a life no one could take from them. But fate in the West was a cruel dealer, and it never let a good hand last long. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, a rider appeared on the ridge. 2 horses behind him, one carrying a rifle. Eli froze. Clara saw his jaw tighten, his eyes darken with something she'd never seen before. Fear. "Who is it?" she asked. He didn't answer at first. Then, after a long silence, he said, "A man I thought was dead." The rider on the ridge came slow, deliberate, like a storm deciding where to break. Dust followed his horse in a long red plume against the dying sun, and by the time he reached the edge of town, silence had fallen over Red Bluff. Eli stood on the porch of Clara's store, his body rigid, his hand hovering near the worn Colt on his hip. Clara stepped beside him, her heart pounding. She could see it in his face. The ghost he'd been running from had found him. The rider dismounted, tying his horse to the post outside the saloon where all of this had begun. He looked up, and the years seemed to collapse between them. "Eli Carter," the man called, his voice hard as iron. "You got nowhere left to run." The crowd began to gather, drawn like moths to danger. Clara's breath caught as she saw the man's eyes. Cold, pale blue, the color of vengeance. He wore a deputy's badge, though tarnished and bent, and his coat bore the dust of 1,000 miles. Eli didn't speak at first. He just stared, his jaw working. Then quietly he said, "Didn't figure you'd be the one to find me, Reed." Reed spat into the dirt. "You killed my brother," he said. The words hit like a gunshot. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Clara turned to Eli, confusion and fear warring in her eyes. "Eli," she whispered. But he didn't answer her. His face was stone. Reed's voice rose. 2 years ago, outside Abilene, you left him to die in the mud. Now you think you can hide behind some woman's skirts and start fresh?" The world seemed to tilt. Clara felt as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. "Is it true?" she asked softly. Eli turned to her then, and she saw the truth in his eyes, raw, regretful, heavy. "It wasn't like that," he said. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Tell it," Reed snarled. "Tell her how my brother begged you to finish him. Tell her how you rode away instead." The crowd pressed closer. The preacher, the shopkeeper, The very same men who'd whispered behind Clara's back now watched, hungry for more. Eli's voice came low, steady. He was dying already, Reed. The war was over, but he wouldn't stop fighting. I tried to save him, God knows I did. But he drew first. You lie, Reed spat. You always did. His hand went to his gun, time slowed. Clara saw Eli's eyes flick to hers, and in that look was everything. Apology, love, and the promise he'd made when he said, let's keep breathing together. The next moment, the world exploded in sound. 2 shots rang out. When the smoke cleared, Reed lay in the dust, his gun still warm. Eli stood over him, his hand trembling, his face white as bone. The crowd scattered like spooked cattle. Only Clara ran toward him. Eli! She cried, grabbing his arm. We have to go now. He blinked as if waking from a dream. There's no going, he murmured. Not after this, but she wouldn't hear it. She dragged him through the back of the store, into the alley that led toward the stables. The sheriff was already shouting orders, men running to saddle horses, rifles glinting in the rising dust. Please, she begged. Run with me. We can cross the ridge by nightfall. They'll never find us. He stopped her, his hands gripping her shoulders. Clara, he said, his voice breaking. If I go, they'll hang you for helping me. You've lost enough because of me already. She shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. You don't understand. I've already lost everything once. I won't do it again. He kissed her then. Fierce, desperate, final. The kind of kiss that belongs to doomed lovers in stories the desert never forgets. If I ride, he whispered against her lips. I'll never stop looking back. Don't make me do that. The sound of boots and shouts drew closer. She could see the torchlight flickering through the alley, shadows growing long. Please, Eli, she said. If you love me, I do, he said. That's why I have to let you go. He tore his hands from hers and turned, disappearing into the night just as the lawman burst through the door. Clara stood frozen as they stormed past her, chasing the sound of hoofbeats fading into the dark. The last thing she saw was his horse leaping over the dry creek bed, the moon catching on his hat like a halo. Then he was gone. By morning, the desert was quiet again, but Red Bluff wasn't. They said the drifter had murdered a man, that the woman he'd bewitched was a sinner beyond saving. The preacher spoke her name from the pulpit that Sunday, his voice full of pity and fire. But Clara didn't go to church. She stayed by the creek where they used to sit, waiting, listening for the sound of hooves that would never come. Days passed, then weeks. The world kept turning as it always does when hearts break in silence. But one evening, when the sun bled red into the sky, she found something near the old fence post, a single silver spur half buried in the dust. She lifted it to her chest, pressed it against her heart, and whispered, "Keep breathing, Eli." That night she lit the lamp in her window again, and this time, she didn't blow it out. Winter came early that year, sweeping through Red Bluff with winds that howled like lost souls. The desert turned pale beneath frost, and the mesquite trees stood black and skeletal against the cold gray sky. Clara still lit the lamp in her window each night, the same way she had the evening Eli rode away. It became her ritual, her rebellion against forgetting. Folks said she'd gone mad, that she was waiting for a ghost. Maybe she was, but she didn't care what they said. She'd known love once, fierce and fleeting, and she'd rather live with its memory than settle for the emptiness that came before it. Weeks turned to months. The lawmen came back from their hunt empty-handed. Some claimed Eli had crossed the border into Mexico. Others swore he'd been shot and buried by bounty riders out near Devil's Canyon. None of them knew for sure, but Clara knew. Deep down she felt it, that the desert had claimed him the same way it claimed everything wild and wounded. Still, she couldn't stop looking for him. Every dawn she'd walk out to the ridge, the wind whipping her hair, scanning the horizon for a dark horse and a gray-eyed man. Every dusk she'd whisper, "Come home," before lighting her lamp. The town grew used to her grief. They stopped gossiping and started avoiding her, as if sorrow were contagious. Children pointed when she passed, calling her the ghost widow. Yet sometimes strangers riding through would pause at the sight of her window glowing in the night. "Who's the woman up there?" they'd ask, and the townsfolk would shake their heads. "She's the one who loved the outlaw," they'd say, and never stopped waiting. One morning in late January, a rider came in from the south, a young ranch hand carrying a weathered saddlebag. He asked for Clara by name. She met him on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the wind. "Ma'am," he said, pulling something from his coat. It was a folded piece of cloth and a bandana, faded red, torn at the edges. "Found this near Dry Bone Pass, thought you'd want to see it." She took it with trembling hands. Embroidered in one corner were the initials EC. Her knees weakened. "Was there anything else?" she asked. The boy hesitated. "A grave," he said quietly, "no name. But someone carved something into the stone." Clara's lips parted, but no words came. She knew before he told her what it said. That evening, she saddled a horse for the first time since he'd left. The trail to Dry Bone Pass was cruel, rocky, narrow, the kind of road that punished both body and heart. But she rode through the biting wind, the lamp from her window tucked inside her satchel like a heart still burning. By the time she reached the canyon, the sun was gone and the desert glowed silver beneath the moon. She found it where the boy said she would, a small mound of stones by a lonely cottonwood. The wind whispered through the branches like a hymn. She knelt and brushed away the dust from the carved words. Just as she'd known, the message was simple, cut deep by a steady hand. Keep breathing. Her breath caught. For a long time she couldn't move, couldn't speak. Then she placed the bandana on the stones, her tears darkening the fabric. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "Now I'll keep mine." She sat there until dawn, the light spilling across the canyon like gold spilling from heaven. When she finally stood, she left the lamp burning beside the grave. Travelers later said that, for years after, they could still see a faint glow there on cold nights, a light that never went out, flickering against the wind like a soul too stubborn to die. Back in Red Bluff, her house stood empty. The shop gathered dust, the porch creaked in the wind, and the lamp in her window was gone. Yet the townsfolk swore that sometimes, during the quietest hours before dawn, the light still flickered there, faint but steady. Some said it was her ghost waiting for him. Others said it was just the wind catching a bit of glass. But a few, the ones who'd known love and lost themselves, believed different. They said it was proof that love, once lit, never truly dies. Years passed. The town changed. Railroads came and the old saloon burned down. But on cold desert nights when the moon rose over the ridge, cowhands would tell her story around the fire. They'd speak of the woman who once ordered a stranger to her bed, and how that one reckless act had turned into something pure, something that outlasted judgment, gossip, and even time. She wasn't crazy, the old men would say, their eyes reflecting the flames. She was just one of those souls born too big for this world, too full of love, too full of sorrow. And he finally found his peace in hers, and somewhere out in the desert the wind still carries her whisper, soft, defiant, eternal. "Keep breathing, Eli. I'm right behind you."